Beneath the twin suns of Zirath Prime, the air was thick with the acrid tang of burned metal and the sharp bite of ozone. Private Caden Harlow staggered through the crumbled remains of what had once been a sprawling city. His vision blurred. His exosuit's warning alarms chimed incessantly, and his ears rang from the last explosion that had sent him tumbling into a crater. The suit was supposed to enhance his strength, but now its power core flickered dangerously low, leaving him to rely on sheer willpower and the stubborn urge to survive. Everywhere he looked, the scenery was the same: skeletal structures standing defiantly against the sky, the charred hulks of armored vehicles smoldering in the heat, and the haunting stillness of bodies, too many to count, strewn across the rubble. Caden's platoon had been decimated in an ambush by enemy drones, sleek, insect-like machines that hunted in swarms, firing high-energy blasts that cut through human defenses like paper. His squad leader, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Corrick, had ordered the retreat, but there had been no fallback point, no safe zone. Just more death and destruction in every direction. Caden didn't even know if anyone else had made it. His communications link had gone down after a near miss scrambled his helmet systems. Now he was alone, his pulse hammering in his ears, each step an agonizing reminder of how close he was to the end. He ducked behind the remnants of a wall, trying to catch his breath, when he heard the faint whirring sound that froze his blood. A drone's engines. It wasn't close yet, but it would be soon. His rifle was long gone, his sidearm empty. Caden gripped a jagged piece of rebar in one trembling hand, knowing it was laughably inadequate. He had maybe seconds before the drone spotted him. Then there'd be no escape. He tried to push himself to move, to find another hiding spot, but his legs felt like lead. The world seemed to tilt around him as exhaustion and despair clawed at his mind, and then he felt the ground tremble beneath him. At first, he thought it was his weakening senses playing tricks on him, but the tremors grew stronger, more rhythmic. A massive shadow fell over him as he finally forced his head to turn. For a moment, he thought he was seeing a hallucination, a strange figure shimmering in the heat haze. But it was real. She was real. She stood nearly 9 feet tall, with skin that glowed faintly green under the harsh light of the twin suns. Her limbs were long and sinewy, her frame powerful, yet graceful. Her golden eyes locked onto his, radiating an intensity that was both commanding and oddly comforting. She wore no armor, only a form-fitting garment that seemed to merge with her skin. In her four-fingered hand, she held a staff of polished metal that hummed with energy. Caden's grip on the rebar faltered. His body went slack as the alien crouched low beside him, her gaze quickly scanning him for injuries. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt too dry, his mind too sluggish to form words. Before he could make sense of what was happening, she moved. The drone's engines grew louder. It was close now, weaving through the ruined streets. Caden tensed, expecting to see a bright flash followed by nothingness. But the alien, his rescuer, moved with startling speed. In a blur, she leapt into the air, a single powerful motion that sent her soaring above the broken landscape. Caden's stomach lurched as he realized she was carrying him, cradling him against her chest as if he weighed nothing. He felt the rush of air against his face, the heat of the sun fading as they entered the shadow of a distant ridge. They landed, softly on the far side of the battlefield, in a small grove of twisted alien trees that offered some cover from the burning sky. The drone didn't follow. Either it had lost them, or the alien had done something to make them vanish from its scanners. Caden wasn't sure. All he knew was that he was alive, and the towering figure standing over him had saved his life. She knelt beside him again, her expression unreadable. But her golden eyes never left his, and in them he saw something unexpected, not the cold, calculating gaze of an invader, but something warmer, something caring. Before darkness finally claimed him, Caden thought he felt her hand rest gently on his forehead, as if to reassure him that he was safe now. When Caden awoke, it felt as though he had drifted into a dream. The harsh brightness of the twin suns was gone, replaced by a soft, iridescent glow that seemed to pulse gently through the room. Or was it a room? It was unlike any place he'd ever seen, with walls that shimmered and shifted, organic yet somehow mechanical. The air was crisp and cool, carrying a faint floral scent that made it easier to breathe. Every muscle in his body felt as though it had been pulled from the battlefield and immersed in something restorative. He tried to sit up, but the bed, or rather the cocoon-like structure he rested on, responded, shifting subtly to support. His back. That's when he noticed the figure. The alien, the one who had saved him, stood just a few feet away. Her tall frame seemed even more imposing in the low light, but there was a calmness in her stance that stopped his fear from fully taking hold. Her skin, a luminous green, appeared to absorb the room's glow. The golden eyes that had locked onto his before were now focused on something she held in her hands, a device that looked like a cross between a tablet and a living vine. She noticed he was awake and stepped closer, her movements fluid and measured. Caden's first instinct was to flinch back, but his body refused to comply. Exhaustion still held him captive, and there was a deeper reason too. Something in her demeanor didn't scream threat. Instead, there was a gentle attentiveness about her, as if she were checking on a wounded animal rather than a captured enemy. She made a low humming sound, rhythmic and calming, before pressing a button on the vine-like device. A panel on the wall unfurled, revealing a set of glowing objects. Caden tried to speak, his voice dry and raspy. What is this place?" The alien turned her head slightly, a quizzical expression crossing her face. She didn't respond, at least not with words. Instead, she tapped her chest lightly with 2 fingers, then extended a hand toward him. It wasn't a gesture of command, but one of introduction. He stared at her hand. It had only 4 fingers, each ending in a softly rounded tip. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand against hers. She made that humming sound again, her golden eyes meeting his, as if to say, "You're safe here." Caden's breath came easier now. She gestured to the glowing objects on the panel, one of which resembled a flask, though it appeared to be made of some translucent crystal. She picked it up and offered it to him. When he didn't take it right away, she tapped the flask lightly and then mimed drinking. Thirst burned in his throat, and caution gave way to desperation. He took the flask and sipped. The liquid inside was unlike anything he'd tasted. Sweet, but not cloying, cool but warming, and it seemed to fill him with a strange, invigorating energy. It wasn't just refreshing, it was revitalizing. For the first time since he had collapsed on the battlefield, Caden felt the fog in his mind begin to lift. "Thank you," he croaked. The alien tilted her head at the sound of his words. Then she pointed at herself, her hand sweeping over her chest, as if indicating her whole being. She tapped the emblem on her chest, a design that looked like an interlocking star and spiral, then pointed at him. The gesture was simple, but Caden understood it as an introduction. "Nova," he murmured, naming her after the star-like emblem. He didn't know what else to call her. "Nova." She repeated the word, her voice soft and musical. It wasn't quite the same as his pronunciation, but it was close enough. They spent the next hour, or maybe longer, communicating in fragments. Nova brought over more items, showing them to him and then using gestures or expressions to convey their purpose. There was a device that emitted a soothing hum when placed near his arm, which she used to ease the lingering pain from his injuries. Another object, A glowing orb projected images into the air, shapes, symbols, and what might have been the outlines of other beings like her. Through it, Nova tried to show him that she wasn't one of the invaders. She displayed the warships that had ravaged his unit, pointing at them with a clear look of disdain. Then she gestured at herself, shaking her head firmly, as if to say, "I'm not one of them." As the pieces came together, Caden realized that Nova wasn't just a rogue alien. She was part of a group, maybe even a whole race, that had no interest in conquest or war. It seemed that her people had mastered their technology to such an extent that they had moved beyond violence. Yet somehow, factions among them had turned these advancements against others, including humanity. Nova wasn't fighting on either side. She was something else entirely, a healer, a protector, a rescuer. By the time he finished his restorative drink, Caden was starting to feel human again. He still didn't fully understand what Nova wanted from him or why she had taken such care to save him. But her actions spoke louder than words. She didn't need to explain herself for him to see that she meant no harm. Caden leaned back into the cocoon, letting his head rest against its surprisingly comfortable surface. Nova busied herself with some controls on the wall, her movements fluid and deliberate. He couldn't keep his eyes open much longer, the effects of her care washing over him in a wave of exhaustion and relief. As he drifted back to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind. Whoever she was, whatever she was, he owed her his life. Caden wasn't sure how long he'd been aboard Nova's ship. In the timeless glow of its gently pulsing walls, he marked the passage of time only by his own recovery. His injuries had all but vanished, his mind clearer now than it had been since before the war. Yet what surprised him most wasn't the physical healing. It was the bond that began to grow between him and his towering alien savior. At first, their interactions were cautious. Caden would watch as Nova worked with her strange vine-like tools, adjusting the room's ambient light or manipulating some unseen control panel that responded to her touch. The ship itself seemed alive, and Nova's movements suggested she understood its workings intimately. She often hummed while she worked, a sound that carried a soothing, almost maternal quality. When she caught Caden watching her, she'd offer a small, patient smile, her golden eyes soft and unthreatening. It wasn't long before Nova began to teach him. She would hold up an object or draw a symbol in the air with her long, graceful fingers, then wait for him to repeat the sound she made. Some of the words were sharp and clicking, others flowed like a melody. He stumbled through them at first, his tongue unused to the strange pronunciations, but Nova never showed frustration. She would hum encouragingly and repeat the word until he managed to mimic it. When he succeeded, she'd tilt her head and emit a warm, trilling sound that he guessed was her version of a laugh. Caden, in turn, tried to teach her his own language. He pointed to himself and said, "Caden." She repeated the word, her voice richer and more musical than his. Then he pointed to her and said, "Nova." She smiled and echoed it again, as if claiming the name for herself. It became a game of sorts, each of them trying to make sense of the other's sounds and gestures. The progress was slow, but each small breakthrough felt monumental. As the days, or what he assumed were days, passed, they moved beyond simple words. Caden would sit cross-legged on the soft floor, drawing shapes or scenes on the ground with his fingers, using dust from a meal supplement Nova had given him. He sketched Earth, a simple sphere with crude land masses. Then he pointed to himself and said, "Earth." Nova watched intently, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. Then she drew her own image, something resembling a cluster of 3 suns, encircled by geometric lines. She tapped it and made a series of clicks and hums. Though he couldn't hope to pronounce it, Caden knew what she was showing him, her home. It wasn't just about learning each other's language, it was about building trust. Caden realized how little he truly knew about Nova or her people, but the more they communicated, the more certain he became that she wasn't like the invaders who had ravaged the human colonies. Nova's presence felt protective, almost nurturing, a stark contrast to the harsh reality he'd known on the battlefield. One day, after a particularly successful lesson, Nova brought over a glowing orb, a device he'd seen her use before, but never so close. She held it in both hands, humming softly, and it began to project moving images into the air. Caden gasped. The holograms showed lush, green landscapes that seemed too perfect to be real, forests of towering trees with crystalline branches, shimmering waterfalls that defied gravity, and floating islands bathed in soft, golden light. Nova gestured to the images, then pointed to herself and made a sweeping motion, as if to say, "This is my home." Caden was stunned. "It's beautiful," he whispered, though he knew she didn't understand the words. Her eyes met his, and he saw something there that he hadn't seen before. Longing. A deep, quiet sadness that spoke of loss. Whatever had brought her to the war-torn ruins of Zerath Prime, it hadn't been by choice. Her home, as idyllic as it appeared, was far away and perhaps out of reach. He wanted to tell her how much he appreciated what she had done for him, how he'd never forget her kindness. He didn't have the words, not yet, but he hoped she could see it in his expression. Nova tilted her head, her golden eyes seeming to study him, and then she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that Caden couldn't fully articulate. In that moment, he knew she understood. She didn't need his words to know how grateful he was. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Nova's care wasn't just about healing his wounds or teaching him her language. She was listening to him, even when he wasn't speaking. Caden told her about his life back on Earth, about the family he'd left behind, the friends who had never made it off the battlefield. He spoke in broken fragments, using the words she'd taught him to fill in the gaps. She would listen in silence, her golden eyes never leaving his, and when he faltered, she would hum softly, a comforting sound that felt like an embrace. Caden had never known his own mother. She'd passed when he was too young to remember her face. Growing up, he'd never had anyone who cared for him the way Nova did. The warmth she showed wasn't just alien. It was something wholly new to him, something he hadn't realized. He'd been missing. By the time Nova's ship began to move again, leaving the ruined world of Zerath Prime behind, Caden felt more than just recovered. He felt renewed. The war, the destruction, the loss, they hadn't vanished. But now there was something else. There was hope. There was the connection he'd forged with a being who, against all odds, had shown him a kind of care he'd never thought possible. Nova's ship moved through the void as if it were gliding on a gentle current, the stars outside shifting in slow arcs. Caden, now stronger and clearer-headed, sat on the floor of the living quarters. Nova had given him space to think, something he hadn't truly done since the war began. He ran his hand across the surface of the cocoon-like seat, its texture smooth yet warm, almost alive. It was as if the ship itself was an extension of Nova, responding to her presence, her intent. It was more than just technology. It was a reflection of the harmony she carried within her. He thought back to the battlefield and the chaos that had defined his existence for so long. For years, survival had been his only goal. But Nova had opened something in him. The peaceful environment of the ship, the patience in her gaze, the gentle hum of her voice. These weren't just comforts. They were reminders that something greater was possible, that there could be a life beyond the endless cycle of conflict. Nova entered the room, her tall figure casting a shadow over him for a moment, before the ambient glow adjusted, softly illuminating her features. She carried an object that looked like a crystalline tablet, its surface rippling with light. She approached, crouching down so her gaze met his, and then held it out. Caden hesitated. "What's this?" he asked, though he doubted she understood. Nova tilted her head, her golden eyes meeting his in an expression that seemed to say, "You'll understand if you look." Taking the tablet, he watched as it came to life. Images filled the surface. No, not just images, memories. He saw what looked like an entire world unfurling before him. Massive crystalline cities that caught and refracted the light of 3 brilliant suns, forests that shimmered with an ethereal glow, oceans of liquid light that seemed to pulse with a living rhythm. This was Aretha, Nova's home. The images shifted, showing her people. They moved with grace and purpose, their every action seemingly in tune with their environment. The Erythan had no need for weapons. Their culture had evolved beyond war, beyond destruction. But the vision turned darker, showing a splinter group breaking away, harnessing their advanced technology for conquest and domination. That group had become the invaders, the ones who had ravaged human colonies. Nova's pain was palpable in these images, the rift between her people and this faction tearing at her very identity. Caden set the tablet down, his chest tight. You came to help, to stop them." Nova nodded slowly. Her fingers traced the edges of the tablet as if smoothing out a memory that still hurt. She looked at him and made a small gesture, placing a hand over her heart, then extending it outward. The meaning was clear. "I'm trying to bring peace." He felt the weight of her mission. She wasn't a soldier or a diplomat, she was something more. A caretaker of lives, a healer of wounds that went far beyond flesh. But it wasn't just about her people anymore. She had risked herself to save him, a stranger, and in doing so had shown him that his life could have a greater purpose. "Nova," he said, his voice steady now. "You want me to see this, to understand it." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I think I do. But what can I do?" Her hand settled lightly on his arm, her golden eyes full of an emotion he could only describe as trust. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she pointed to a new image that appeared on the tablet, a small, shimmering beacon of light. She gestured to herself, then to him, then to the beacon. The meaning wasn't lost on Caden. She wanted him to help her spread that light, to share what he'd learned here with others, to show that, even in the shadow of war, there was a way forward that didn't rely on destruction. The ship's hum changed, a subtle shift in tone that made Caden look up. A view from the ship's exterior filled the room, showing a distant planet unlike any he'd seen before. It glowed softly, its atmosphere alive with shifting colors. "Aretha," Caden stood, his heart pounding. For so long he'd lived in survival mode, never thinking about what came after. But Nova had taught him that survival wasn't enough. Now there was more. A place to learn, to grow, and to find a way to bridge the gap between two species. Even in the face of distrust and bloodshed, the war hadn't vanished. He knew that. But perhaps if he could carry the kindness Nova had shown him, he could help others see that peace was possible. Nova touched his shoulder gently, her expression as steady and calm as ever. And in her gaze, Caden found something he hadn't felt in a long, long time.